everybody. This is S.J. Thomason with Christian-Apologist.com, and today we are going to review a debate between a Christian named Dinesh D'Souza and an atheist or agnostic, not sure exactly which way he identifies at this point, named Bart Ehrman, and the debate was on Socrates in the City. And so here we go. You've come to the right place. This is where truth matters. S.J. Thomason at Christian-Apologist.com. Let's listen.
And then in my debates with some of the leading atheists, I realized that they'd often say that they didn't believe in God. They would invoke science and evolution. They talk about the evils of Christianity. But as you began to push back against those arguments, they would often back off or relent and then turn to something that essentially made them very angry with God. I was debating Michael Shermer, the editor of Skeptic magazine, a self-proclaimed man of science. And in a recent debate, he said, but what really turned me against Christianity, he said, I was in college and I had a beautiful girlfriend, and then she was paralyzed in an accident. And I went down on my knees and I prayed to God to heal her, but he didn't. And he said, and then that was it. That was the tipping point. I decided that's enough of it for me with Christianity. And for a moment, as I saw him visibly kind of moved by retelling this incident, it occurred to me that in many cases, these are not atheists. They are, in fact, wounded theists. It's not that they don't believe in God. They're kind of angry with God. They have a beef with God. And their atheism is a form of revenge. It's a form of hitting back against God for what he has done or what he has failed to do. And as I thought about this, and it occurred to me that actually here is a weird case where the Christian, the believer, is actually in exactly the same boat. The Christian also is a wounded theist. Why? Because it's very easy to affirm God and Christianity and salvation, but then when you lose your daughter or your brother in an unforeseen disaster, you turn around and say, God, what the heck? Why did you do this to me? You have the power to cure, to heal, but you're evidently not exercising that power. And so the Christian, too, is in exactly the same position of having a beef, if you will, with God. This makes this topic, I think, particularly interesting. I want to begin by looking at it in the philosophical way that Bart outlined. But then I also want to look at suffering in a practical way, in an experiential way, because suffering to me is not an intellectual problem. It's an emotional problem. It's not a problem, if you will, of a failure of logic. It's a problem of a kind of emotional breakdown in the face of unendurable pain. Now,
I wanted to point something out. And so in this particular debate, Bart focuses on the idea of God being omnibenevolent, omnipotent, I should say. And so he's all love, and he's all powerful. And if God is full of all love and all powerful, why would he allow suffering? And as Dinesh pointed out in this debate, he's got an underlying hidden premise in that suffering is not for a greater purpose. Catholics always say, offer it up. Offer it up. Now, why would they say offer it up? When you suffer, offer it up. Well, you're offering up your suffering to benefit somebody else, because this world we live in is a very evil world. We're in the midst of a spiritual battle, and we're sinful people. And so when you take all of those components and put them together, I realize that if somebody is able to suffer well, is able to suffer and offer it up, that can be used by God in a way to bless us. It sounds funny, it sounds strange, but we can see in the book of Job how there is sometimes an ultimate purpose of suffering. And the ultimate purpose basically is to offer it up and to show that we have faith in God, and also to show we have faith in eternity. There's an interesting person called Dan Rehill, who is an exorcist priest who works out of Tennessee. And one of the things that Dan Rehill said that Jesus showed him at one point was a little picture of a beach. And on the beach, he showed him a little speck of sand. And he said, basically, this life is the speck of sand, and full life is eternity. So anything that we go through in this life is but a speck of sand towards our eternity. And where is our eternity? It's in heaven. I've heard something else offered. So the suffering we have here is just minuscule compared to our overall eternity in the face of God, with the face of God, experiencing the beatific vision, experiencing eternal love, eternal beauty, eternal mercy, eternal justice, experiencing all of that. And it's going to be a wonderful place, a wonderful existence, a wonderful purpose. And the entire purpose of this existence is to get us into eternity and to get our sisters and brothers into eternity and to get Bart Ehrman into eternity, eternity of bliss and love in the face of Jesus. Now, I wanted to point out an old story that I heard from another Christian that I think is a really good story. He basically said that the story of this old Chinese person. So there was a Chinese person who lived on a farm, and one day he had one horse, and the horse lived in his barn. And one day that one horse that he had disappeared, took off, escaped. And all of these other Chinese people came to him and they said, "Oh my, your horse escaped. What a terrible thing." And he said, "Maybe yes, maybe no." And the next day, the horse returned, and it returned and brought 5 other horses with it. So there were 6 horses in the barn. And so the people in his town came to him and said, "Oh my, this is wonderful. Your horse returned and brought 5 other horses. Boy, you've been graced with a lot of blessings. This is tremendous." And the Chinese man said, "Maybe yes, maybe no." The next day, his son went into the barn and was cleaning the horses, taking care of the horses, feeding the horses, and unfortunately somehow tripped and broke his leg. And the Chinese people came to his place and they said, "Oh my, this is horrible. Your son, he's tripped. He broke his leg." And the Chinese father said, "Maybe yes, maybe no." And the next day, the emperor in China said that there was going to be a tremendous war and that everyone was going to have to fight it. Every male of a certain age was going to have to enter this war. And anyone who was healthy would have to enter the war. And the Chinese man's son could not enter the war because he had broken his leg. And so the Chinese people, the townspeople, came to him and said, "Oh my, your son, he doesn't have to go to war. He doesn't have to go fight because he broke his leg. This is a tremendous blessing." And the Chinese man said, "Maybe yes, maybe no." In other words, our long-term purpose and what God does to make a difference in our lives could be good, and we'll all be used for the purpose of good. That's what Jesus does. He said many things, and one of them is that he will turn whatever seems like a terrible thing, a terrible suffering, into a blessing at some point. So let's go.
You have 3 propositions. God is omnipotent, God is benevolent or loving, and there is evil and suffering in the world. And on the face of it, there appears to be a contradiction in affirming all those 3 premises. But if you think about it, the contradiction disappears if you supply the hidden premise. There's nothing inherently contradictory by saying God is omnipotent, God is loving, there's evil and suffering. There's no logical incoherence here. The logical incoherence only emerges when you add the following hidden premise: God has no moral justification for permitting the evil and suffering that in fact exists. If that is true, then the syllogism is totally watertight. So the question before us, as I see it, is to turn that assumption into a question. Does God have any good reason for allowing the evil and suffering? Not just evil and suffering, but the amount of evil and suffering that we see in the world. If there is a possible or plausible reason for God to allow it, then the syllogism collapses, and there's no contradiction in affirming God's omnipotence and benevolence, even though there's a lot of evil and suffering in the world. I want to start by focusing for a moment on the book of Job that Bart mentioned, because it is true that Job is faced with this incomprehensible suffering. But what's really interesting about that story is that the reader of Job has a kind of double perspective. We can see what's going on with Job, but we can actually also see what's going on with God. We have a kind of bird's eye view. We can see God bargaining with the Satan. We can see the reason for Job's suffering. And the reason for Job's suffering is not that Job is a bad guy. Job's friends say that, but they're wrong. The reason for Job's suffering is that God and the Satan have entered into an arrangement. There is a kind of test underway. We know the reason that Job is suffering. So even though Job's suffering is incomprehensible to him, it is not incomprehensible to us. We are actually given, if you will, the second perspective. Nor is Job's suffering incomprehensible to God. When God shows up before Job, he does not say, I don't believe, contrary to what Bart says. Suffering has no answer. I don't believe he squishes Job. I don't believe he ever says to Job, you shouldn't question. When he says to Job, were you present when the foundations of the world were laid? What is God getting at? What's he actually saying? What he seems to be saying, it seems to me, is your knowledge is local. My knowledge is divine. Your knowledge is ultimately human knowledge. It's based on an extremely narrow compass, a very limited perspective. You don't have the God's eye view. And therefore, as humans, if you say, I don't see any reason why a fawn in a forest should be consumed by a forest fire, what you're really saying is that as a human being, I don't see the reason, but it doesn't follow that there is no reason. In other words, in order for that statement to hold weight, you basically have to find fault with God's architecture of the universe. And in some sense, that, it seems to me, is the topic that we are debating. Why did God design the world in the way that he did?
And that's the big question. And the other thing that was not brought up so much in this debate that's pretty important was the idea of Jesus. So Christianity is the one religion that really explains our existence as well as it possibly could. Think about it. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And what did we do? Jesus predicted what we were going to do. Jesus predicted that he was going to be crucified and that he was going to be killed in the most merciless way possible by the people he loved. And that was shown in the book of Psalms. It said he would be pierced. His hands and his feet would be pierced, as Psalm 22. However, he's to be the ruler of the world. That said that in Psalm 2. And in Genesis 3:15, we were told that there was going to be this eternal battle, a battle between good and evil. He would strike your heel and you would strike his head. And so we have that whole idea, the whole setup between the divine Jesus coming into the world and setting things straight. Because as you know, even from the Gospels, the devil had been given a certain place in the world. Satan had been given certain powers, and his minions had been given dominion over particular places. That's spelled out really well in The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser. But we knew that when Jesus came in, that he was going to set things straight. And what was he going to do? He was going to give himself for the sins of the world. He was going to sacrifice himself as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, the Lamb of the Passover Lamb, the Paschal Lamb. In fact, during the week of the Passion, he offered himself up. First, he appeared and offering himself as the sacrifice when he came into Jerusalem and was hailed as the king, basically. Came into Jerusalem on a donkey as predicted in Zechariah 9:9. And he was hailed as the king, presenting himself as the Paschal Lamb. And then on the night before he was crucified, he offered the bread and the wine as his body and blood, just as predicted in Sirach, what he did. And he also predicted it in the Wisdom of Solomon, how people were going to gang up against him. In Psalms, we see that he was pierced, his hands and his feet were pierced, and also that the bulls of Bashan were surrounding him and dividing up his clothes. And they did that when he was on the cross. And when he was asked by the high priest who he was, if he was the Son of the Most High, he said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of glory and sitting on the crown. Sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One. That is basically affirming that he was the Word made flesh from Daniel 7 and from Psalm 110. And the fact that he was pierced, as predicted in Isaiah 53 and Zechariah 12:10, the fact that he was pierced as he was and he was killed in the way that he was, just shows that God doesn't, this life, this temporal life that we have, there's going to be suffering. Even his own son, who is completely innocent, suffered on the cross in a way that we can't even imagine. Some people say, oh, it's just a few days that he suffered. Well, actually, when you think about it, the fact that he has inner knowledge of everyone and of the people that he loves and of the betrayals that occurred. The kind of suffering that he went through is far beyond anything we could possibly even imagine. Now, I'm going to skip ahead here. It's interesting because one thing that Dinesh pointed out in this particular debate was he pointed out that Bart likes to bring up starvation in Africa and all kinds of things like that, as many atheists do. They like to show pictures and images of people who are starving in other parts of the world. Some of them don't realize that the setup is in a way that we are supposed to be charged with helping these people. But beyond that, Dinesh also pointed out that Bart himself is not suffering. Bart himself lives a rather plush life. He lives in the United States, which I would argue that is probably winning the lotto of life if you're born in the United States. It's a wonderful place to live. But anyway, we're going to zoom ahead here to some other arguments. Now, they went into some arguments based on the design of the world. That's kind of beyond what I want to talk about today. But let's go.
They're suffering. The Bible never gives, isn't it true, a single answer to the problem of suffering.
It gives a lot of answers that are contradictory. So that, for example, within the book of Job, Job's friends think that he's suffering because he's being punished. The author doesn't think it's because he's being punished, but it's because he's righteous.
And that's not contradictory to have one person think something and another person think something else. That's actually one of the biggest problems with Bart in this debate. He is the Kathy Newman of agnostics. What do I mean by that? When Kathy Newman went up against Jordan Peterson, Jordan Peterson sat there and he talked about the gender pay gap and about how we have assessments of the gender pay gap coming out of the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development that are based on zero control variables. Uncontrolled variables. That's a problem. If you talk about the gender pay gap and you talk about differences in male and female pay, and you don't control for important factors such as the hours, average hours a week worked, the types of jobs chosen by men and women, you don't control for any of those important factors, you're going to see a pay gap, which we do, which is something like 82 cents on the dollar worldwide. However, if you control for those important variables, as PayScale did, you're going to find that pay gap is reduced dramatically to between 97 cents to the white man's dollar and $1.03. Asians make $1.03 to the white man's dollar. But I digress. The reason I'm bringing that up is because what Kathy did is what Bart does consistently through this entire debate, which is extremely annoying. What he does is he'll basically say, well, does that mean, like just like the gender pay gap, Kathy's saying, does that mean that you justify the gender pay gap? You think it's good that females make less than men? She's inserting all of these straw men and all of these red herrings. And that's what Bart does consistently through this debate. He views contradictions as the views of one person in the Bible versus another person in the Bible. That's hardly a contradiction. People have different views on things all through the world. But I'm going to continue. I'm going to move ahead of this because I find that a little too annoying.
The point I want to make about the Bible, if I may, is just that the Bible is not a book of reasons. The Bible tells us God made the world. The Bible doesn't say why. The Bible tells us Jesus is the Son of God, but the Bible doesn't give proofs or reasons. The Bible
the Bible does. Throughout the prophets, time after time after time, say, Israel, you're suffering because you've sinned and God is punishing you.
And isn't the key word there Israel?
Yes, Israel. And then the whole point is God is punishing it. So the question is, why do the people of God suffer? And it's because God is punishing them.
Let me frame a last question.
It was because God was punishing them. And actually, we're okay with that. C.S. Lewis has a great way of putting this. He called it the hammering process. Read his book, Mere Christianity, if you haven't had a chance. It's an excellent book. But in the Old Testament, we see a lot of things. In fact, let me just bring up a couple of things that we see in the Old Testament that I think are relevant to this conversation, in case you don't know the history of Israel. And so we know that probably around 1300 to 1500 BC, there was a person called Moses. And Moses lived in Egypt, and he was given up as a child because they were going to murder all these kids. And so he was given up by the Jewish people, and he was a Jewish parent, and he was put into a basket and he was given over to the Pharaoh, and he was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter, and he was a beautiful person, but he recognized the fact that he was actually an Israelite, and God charged him with a very important charge. He charged them to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and into the promised land, into Canaan. Canaan was the promised land. Canaan is modern day Jerusalem, modern day Israel. And so he charged Moses to do that. And Moses did do that, and he led them into there. But what happened, and also was predicted in the books that Moses wrote most of the first 5 books of the Bible, what they would call the Torah. Moses wrote the Pentateuch, what we would call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. What he predicted was that if the Jewish people did not obey God and didn't follow the ways, they would go into exile. And guess what? They did go into exile. Right around 722 BC, we see a record of this exile, the first exile. We had first under Solomon, and after Solomon's children came into place, right around the year 1000, Solomon built the first temple, as you know, and his children separated. So we had the 12 tribes of Israel. 2 were in the south, 10 were in the north. They separated. And the northern kingdoms were given over to Assyria under the Assyrian, right around the 8th century BC. And we see the whole record of that by the book of Isaiah. Now, Isaiah predicted something was going to happen. He predicted that not only was the Assyrian kingdom going to fail, but it was going to be taken over by the Babylonian kingdom. And guess what? The Babylonians took the southern tribes into exile, and that occurred right around the 6th century BC. The whole record of that, the first temple falling in 586 BC, the whole record of the first temple being rebuilt in 516 BC, that was all given to us by Isaiah dozens of years before he was even born. Over 100 years before Isaiah was even born. Before this all occurred, Isaiah predicted this kind of stuff in 722 BC. The other thing that Isaiah said was that King Cyrus, the Medo-Persian king, was going to take over from Babylon. And he did in 539 BC. King Cyrus took over from Babylon. And so then we had in the book of Daniel, it was predicted. Daniel lived during the Babylonian kingdom. Following him would be the Medo-Persian kingdom. Following that would be the Greek kingdom. Following that would be this wonderful kingdom out of which our Savior would be born. And of course, that was the Roman Empire. And in Daniel, we also see that the Roman Empire was going to split. It was going to split in 2. Daniel predicted all that. So we have some amazing prophets in the Old Testament who predicted some amazing stuff. Now, Isaiah even named King Cyrus. Okay, King Cyrus came over in 539. Now, Daniel also said when the call to rebuild Jerusalem went out, not the call to rebuild the temple, which occurred again, it was finished in 516 BC, but the call to rebuild Jerusalem went out. It would be 483 years until the anointed one would be cut off. Well, what happened? That's in Daniel 9, 24 to 27, in case you're wondering. Well, between 457 and 444 BC, that call to rebuild Jerusalem went out twice. And guess what? Jesus appeared and was cut off around the year 33 AD, just as predicted. That's right within the window of when Daniel predicted this was going to occur. So we see some amazing stuff coming out of the Old Testament, but we also see the fact that the Jewish people were punished. The Israelites were punished. Yes, God does punish people for sin. The wages of sin is death, right? So God punishes people. In fact, the entire humanity, we're built and we die just as told in Adam and Eve because of our sins. We're a sinful people. That's why Jesus had to come. Somebody without sin had to appear to be able to relinquish us, to free us from our sins and the fact that at that point we were basically stuck in hell, stuck in this eternal existence, stuck in this sleep until Jesus freed us. And he did that right after his crucifixion. But here we go.
I just came back from a trip to Kenya and Indonesia and India.
Excuse me. We're officially out of time for this now, but I like what I'm hearing.
I like.
And since I'm the God of this universe,
I'm eager to hear this
I
one
am
too.
allowed to change the rules. So I would love it if you would continue
That's right.
along.
All right.
But even I cannot make Coca-Cola legally. But please, go ahead.
I'll just make this the last question, Bart. And to me, it's a conundrum, namely that you mentioned discovering the problem of suffering. You say in your book that you haven't suffered a lot. You've had a happy life. And yet in the book, you talk about, as you mentioned today, the Ethiopians and the Rwandans and famine and so on. Here, to me, is a paradox, and that is that if you actually go to those countries, the Rwandans, when they suffer, don't seem to turn away from God. The Ethiopians find that suffering pulls them closer to God. Historically, people have lived in much more terrible conditions than we have now, and they haven't seen suffering as a cause to become atheists. So it's paradoxical that you are alienated from God because of the suffering of the Rwandans, but the Rwandans don't feel that way. Why not?
I think that's the most beautiful question. And I wanted to highlight that with a quick point. There's a wonderful book that you should all read. It's called The Globe Study of 62 Societies. And the Globe Study was written around 2005 by a group of academics, in business academics. And what they looked at leadership around the world, and they also looked at what they called humane orientation. What is humane orientation? It's a combination of benevolence, which is goodness to the in-group, and universalism, which is goodness to the out-group, animals, the planet, that kind of thing. So it's a combination. It's a really good thing to have a high level of humane orientation. And guess what? To pad what Dinesh is saying, the highest levels of humane orientation are found in the places where people suffer the most. Some of the highest levels of humane orientation are in Africa, in some of the places that Dinesh is mentioning here. And the other thing, just to highlight what Dinesh is saying, people in Africa, something like 97, 98, 99% of people in those countries believe in God. And where are the lowest levels of humane orientation? Well, the absolute lowest happen to be in Germany, which is really sad. Especially my brother lives in Germany. But it's really sad that those are where the lowest levels. The lowest levels tend to be where the government has granted a whole bunch of social safety nets to take care of you from cradle to grave, and taken some of that authority away from the church, because the churches traditionally, through years, through decades, through centuries, the churches have taken care of people, and people have gone to the church and seek God, and go into the church and seek help for their financial situation when they're in trouble. But the interesting thing is, in some of the places with the biggest social safety nets and the biggest welfare programs, and where the churches aren't relied upon so much, we tend to see the lowest levels of humane orientation and highest levels of atheism. Isn't that sad? Isn't that sad? Some of the highest levels of atheism and agnosticism are coming out of Europe. United States is sort of a strange place, because from all those predictions, from being a wealthy country and having all that we do, we're some of the biggest givers on the planet. And we have pretty high levels of belief in God, relatively speaking, compared to our Western counterparts. Again, lower levels in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, other places besides Europe, in the Western countries. But we have some very high levels. Why is that? Well, one is we don't have care from cradle to grave. We don't have the highest levels of welfare programs. We don't have extremely high levels of tax. You know, one of my colleagues considers Denmark, where he came from, a socialist hellhole. Why is that? Because their taxes are insanely high. In fact, if you buy a car in some places in Europe, you're paying 100 to 200% in taxes, because they don't want you driving. They don't want you guzzling gas. They don't want you doing all this kind of stuff. They've got these windmills. Anyway, I digress. Let's listen to what Bart says about this.
I'd say several things. One thing, I don't feel alienated from God because I don't believe God exists. Secondly, I don't think that people who are suffering necessarily are the ones that you want to go to find out why there is suffering. In other words, there are, if you want to know why cancer is attacking your spouse's body, you go to an oncologist.
Okay, so anyway, he's getting into, I think you do go to the people who are suffering to find out whether or not they believe in God and how they're addressing the suffering. You know, it's really interesting, because the pastor of the Lutheran church where my mother-in-law goes, he said something very interesting after a funeral. He said people after a funeral choose one of two paths. They either seem to move a lot closer to God, or they move a lot further from God. I think that when you suffer, if you want to understand your suffering better, you move closer to God and understand that you can give your suffering up. You can give it up to help others. It sounds hard to understand. It's definitely a Catholic thing to say that, give up the suffering to help others. But there's a lot of Lutherans, a lot of Protestants, a lot of people, Greek Orthodox, who would also agree. You can offer it up. Offer up your suffering for the benefit of others, for the benefit of people who don't see God or don't seek God. You can say prayers for those people and offer up your sacrifices, offer up the times that you go to church, offer up any of your sacrifices. The Mass in Catholic Church is called the sacrifice. It's offering up your sacrifice to benefit others. And so it's something that you can do. Now, I've got a couple people here in the chat who look like they're atheists, probably siding with Bart, agree with Bart on some things. I also think Jason and Chuck, Chuck McNorris and Jason Peak 8244, I hope you come to believe in Jesus. I hope you come to believe in God. And I think that if you look at Jesus' example, he, of all religions, was the only Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He lowered himself. In fact, one of the reasons why they say a third of the angels rebelled against God, the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, was because the Son said he was going to lower himself to humanity. The angels were made above us. They were infused with perfect knowledge right at the get-go. And so for Satan and a third of the angels, they could not handle this idea of the second person of the Trinity. Again, Jesus is one person of three divine persons, with one divine nature, fully human, fully divine, but has this singular divine nature. We had one of them, Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, say that he was going to become flesh and dwelt among us. And that was something that the devil could not handle. He further could not handle the fact that Jesus was going to be born of a lowly human, a lowly little Jewish woman, Mother Mary, who was perfect in every way. But I digress. Anyway, so thank you for coming in today. If you like this kind of content, please like, subscribe, and do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. But also say prayers for our fellow humans here. Hell is a horrible place. I don't want to, I never really throw that thread out there, but it's really something that you don't want. You don't want an existence without God, because that's an existence without light, love, beauty, truth, justice, mercy. It's an existence without all of the perfections of God. And so to have an existence like that is to be living in injustice, and all of the counterparts of all of those features I just named. So you don't want to be in that existence. Thank you for coming in. Again, God bless you. May God keep you. May God love you, and may you love God just as he loves you.